Hi, good afternoon everyone. So now, since we've already done discussing the famous schools that related or connected to science and technology, now let's unlock how does the science and technology been developed, or when does the science and technology been started. So basically, it started from the word itself, indigenous science. So now, our lesson for this afternoon is indigenous science and technology, particularly in the specific place in our place, of course, in the Philippines. So now, before we unlock the terminology called indigenous science, let's know first what is the objective or the main goal of this discussion. Number one is to discuss the concept of indigenous science. When we literally said concept of indigenous science, meaning to say we will identify or we will be unlocking the terminology itself. We will be knowing the definition of indigenous science, what is the connection of indigenous science through science itself, what is the connection of indigenous knowledge system of or IKS to the science and technology, or there is somewhat related relationship between the IKS to science. And of course, not only that, we will be knowing also the contribution of indigenous science in the development of science and technology here in the Philippines. To start with, let's discuss first the very important terminologies in indigenous science, and that is indigenous knowledge system, or it has an abbreviation called IKS. What is this IKS? Indigenous knowledge system is literally embedded in your daily life experiences as a young children or as we grow up. Meaning to say, if we literally explain what is IKS, I can explain it into three ways only. Number one is we can explain IKS or indigenous knowledge system basically from knowing the environment, the weather, agriculture, science and technology, and of course the medicine itself. Number two, we can basically explain IKS based on laws, politics, traditional councils, or even the structure of leadership. Not only that, the last way which you can develop or which you can identify or explain what is IKS, this is the term called spirituality. So meaning to say, basically, if we're literally explaining the three ways, when we say IKS, it is basically on your traditional knowledge. Not only traditional knowledge. This traditional knowledge is basically related to your community or a culture. So meaning to say, IKS is basically the traditional knowledge of each culture or each community. Not only that, it is also basically a respect to the earth, so, to our earth or for the earth. Why? Because IKS is a basis, or IKS is a basis of what? Of earth. How does the earth started? Why? Because it is a traditional knowledge. Not only the earth itself, but it more explained through the knowledge of your culture. Okay? That's why it's called traditional culture. Next is it is also can be explained through contemporary knowledge. Okay? It is also sometimes part of your indigenous knowledge. So meaning to say your contemporary knowledge is basically a part of your indigenous knowledge. Ma'am, what is indigenous knowledge? It is your traditional knowledge. When we say traditional knowledge, it basically explains where do you came from, your culture, your community itself. That is your indigenous knowledge. And of course, lastly, it is part also on how we decrease the number of traditional group. That is basically how can you explain the three ways in IKS. So now let's move forward on the importance of it. When we say IKS kasi, or indigenous knowledge system, it basically explains or has an importance in the basis for problem solving. Not only that, it is also a component of global knowledge. It is also an underutilized resources, and it can increase responsiveness. So these are the important way on explaining what is IKS, or this is the importance of indigenous knowledge system. And aside from that, according to the references, when we say IKS, this is how you live and grow, where the members of the community prominently practice indigenous knowledge. So meaning to say, this is basically on where do you came from, or what is knowledge given by your ancestry, given by your family, your parents, the culture of your parents that you've usually been adopted already. So that is the IKS. Meaning to say, when we say IKS, it is traditional knowledge. It is the knowledge came from your community. It is the culture came from your parents or the certain society. So basically, this is actually a lesson, or this lesson comprise a good values. Where? What kind of values is that? A good values pertaining to the life of your ancestry and pertaining to the culture that you have in a certain community. And of course, these are some examples of indigenous knowledge that actually been taught or practiced by indigenous people. So these are those. Number one, predicting weather, condition, and season using knowledge and observing animals. So that is basically been practice of indigenous people. We've already know what are those IPs, right? But indigenous knowledge system can be acquired into a certain individual, kasi basically all of us has its certain culture. All of us ay may sariling pinagmulan. So basically our IKS is in the traditional knowledge that we have. And that traditional knowledge is not been taught by the teacher or by the school itself. It been taught by the culture or the community that you came from. Diba? So, this is actually the examples of what or how the community practice indigenous knowledge system. This is basically an example for those people that is part of indigenous people or part of indigenous people. So using of herbal medicine, that is actually correct or been it's a factual basis. Preserving of food, of course. Classifying plants and animals into families and groups. Preserving and selecting good seeds for planting. Using indigenous technology in daily lives. Building local irrigation system, of course, because as we all know, when we're literally saying indigenous people or indigenous knowledge system, our way of resources or our way of food or even the house materials of our house is basically on the local irrigations or local ways. Like for example, irrigation system can be found in what? In, of course, if you are planting planting a food, di ba? If you are planting, or like for example, if farming, there's a irrigation system. So basically here, the way of food in a society or in a community of indigenous people are one good example of having a way of food is planting a food or farming. And that farming needs what? Irrigation system or water storage. Not only that, classifying different types of soil for planting based on cultural properties. And lastly, keeping the custom of growing plants and vegetable in the yard. So this is basically an example of IKS in one good example of people or a community, and that is the indigenous people. But not only them, we or us or as individual possesses IKS, because all of us has its own community. All of us has its own culture. Kasi when we say IKS, sabi ko nga kanina, it is basically your traditional knowledge. And where does your traditional knowledge came from? It came from your culture in a certain community. It came from the society that you have, or it can be taught by your parents, a certain group, or a certain organization. Basically, if we literally explain the differences between science to IKS, it is somewhat related to one another. Why? Because if we said science is based on experiments, right? It is based on experiment, while the IKS or the indigenous knowledge system is based on historical knowledge. As we all know, before we go on to the experimental basis, we need to focus now to the historical knowledge. We need to know the background of our study. So that's why science and IKS is somewhat related. Not only that, science is much more has an impact or larger impact on the Western is influence. That we already know that one kasi in the previous topic, Western influences is very known, right? And that is in the field of science. It is somewhat related also in the IKS. Why? Because IKS uses daily survival. When we say daily survival, those materials that we can see or they can found in the certain yard or in a certain community, yun ang ginagamit nila. For example, plants, animals, or even a spiritual aspect. Diba? As we all know in the background of science and technology, in our previous topic, usually our ancestor use plants and animals for the daily basis, and that is IKS. Diba? Traditional knowledge. So that's why science and IKS is somewhat related. Not only that, science is based on natural events. And that natural events somewhat has accompanied with medicinal uses, and that is IKS. So literally, if we're trying to identify the differences between science and IKS, there is no difference at all. Why? Because they are related to one another. There's no science itself if there's no indigenous knowledge system. Because we will be needing traditional knowledge before we conquer the science or before we conquer the new knowledge that we knew. Diba? So that makes or that literally explain what is IKS or Indigenous Knowledge System. So now let's move forward to identify or to know what is indigenous science. Okay? So literally, since we've already know what is IKS or Indigenous Knowledge System, indigenous science is actually a part of indigenous knowledge system. Why? It is actually practiced by the group of people and early civilization. So meaning to say, when we say indigenous science, it has been practiced by the group or by the ancestry that we have. This is particularly, or this is called the traditional science. Why it is called traditional science? Because it is practiced by our ancestors or ancestry. This is practiced by an early civilization. And not only that, when we say kasi indigenous science, it is a complex of knowledge, an expertise, a practice, and representation that guide human societies and their innumerable interaction with the natural sources like agriculture, medicine. They also explain natural phenomena, strategies for coping with changing environment. So basically, when we say indigenous science or traditional science, this is basically used by our ancestors. They use it not only to the broader side of knowledge, they use it to the day-to-day basis. When we say day-to-day basis, they need it to survive. That's why when we say IKS or Indigenous Knowledge System, it is a way of survival. How they can survive it, or how can they aim the survival term? They can aim it basically from what they see in the surroundings or in their yard or in the community, and that is literally the plants and animals. They culture it, they make it as a food, they make it as a way of transportation, and that is belong to indigenous knowledge. And not only that, it also claimed that it is a collectively lived in the experience by a people of a given culture. So meaning to say, it's not basically on the one side of individual or the one side of group. It is literally on the other ancestor or ancestry that living in that era. So meaning to say, different culture, different people, different individual is practicing indigenous science. Okay? So, not only that, it basically explains that it includes everything. That's why we usually try to identify science as everything. And in that day or in that era also, indigenous science is everything for them, for our ancestors, because that is called in traditional science. Why it is everything? Because it's included metaphysics, philosophy, or practical technology. They also practiced by indigenous people both past and present. And also, they elaborated the idea by explaining that science is a part of culture, correct? And how science is done largely depends on the cultural practice of the people. So meaning to say, that's why indigenous science is literally everything, because as our ancestors explains, that it explains everything from past and present. Even on the early civilization that we have, it existed also in the present times or right now. And that belongs to those people that is belong to what? Indigenous people, or those people that indigen, okay, or those IPs. So meaning to say, it existed from past to present. It is moving forward, or it's like passing through from past to present. The ancestor given or give the indigenous science, or the way or the process on how to do that one to the what? Generation to generation. Okay, to explain it further, these are they're actually a list of belief in indigenous that is desirable values that are relevant or consistent in scientific attitude. Number one is motivating attitude. Not only that, they also describe it as a cooperating attitude and practical attitude. And lastly, we have reflected attitude. So meaning to say, in that era, or in that particular time, those indigent or those people that living in that time possesses this kind of character. They have motivating attitude, they have cooperating attitude, and they is more practical than us, and they usually reflect every day they done the day-to-day basis, di ba? And this cultural beliefs therefore can be good foundation for developing positive values toward learning and doing science, in bringing science in personal level. So meaning to say, it that particular list is a guarantee that you can have a positive values. Okay, it is basically a guarantee that if you possesses that four core values of an indigenous belief, you can possess as positive values. And it explains also that indigenous science knowledge has developed diverse structures and content through the interplay between society and environment. Correct. And its developmental stages of most sciences are characterized by continual competition between a number of distinct views of nature, each partially derived from and all roughly compatible with the dictates of scientific observation and method. So basically, through year by year or through era by era, it is basically uh, being built, or it is basically been given by the people that living in that era. It passes, as I've said a while ago, that when we say indigenous science, it's not only in that kind of era. It is passes throughout the generation to generation until now it's been existed. And that indigenous science is also called as science right now. Why? When we say indigenous, as I've said, it is traditional way of culturing science. It is traditional way on explaining science. That's why if you literally identify the difference between IKS and IS, or indigenous science, or the science itself, it is not, there's no particular difference, because it is a part of IKS. Okay, it is a part of indigenous knowledge system. Okay, and it is also pointed that indigenous science provide what? The basic of course, astronomy, pharmacology, food technology. So meaning to say, it is a part of field of science. It is traditional way on how to culture science, because basically it provides what? Different field of science. Astronomy is a field of science, pharmacology is a field of science, and so on, so forth. So this can be explained also accordingly to compose traditional science that uses science process skills and guided by community values and culture. How can we explain it? Through this. This is the concept of indigenous science. So literally, indigenous science uses science process skills. Correct. That's why I'm saying a while ago that science is part of indigenous science, while indigenous science is part of indigenous knowledge system. Not only that, indigenous science is guided by community or culture. That's why it's called traditional, because it is used by our ancestors. Not only that, it composed of traditional knowledge. Correct. Why it is traditional? Because it is literally explained by our ancestor. It is literally has been done by the community in that era. Okay? Traditionally. There's no technology at all. They uses their bare hands. They uses plants and animals to culture the field of science. So that makes or that is the composition of indigenous science. Okay? So indigenous science is uses science processing such as observing, right, classifying, comparing, and it is guided by culture and community because you can read this one. That is the reason. And indigenous science is composed of traditional knowledge, practiced and valued by people of the community. That's why I'm saying a while ago, I just summarized the thought of it. Okay? So that's, I think, literally the end of our discussion. And of course, indigenous science is very important to the development of science and technology in the Philippines. Why? Because the ancient civilization or the indigenous science gave birth to the development of science and technology. That's correct. That's why it's called, that's why science or process of science is a part of indigenous science because indigenous science begin science. Okay? That is the explanation about that. It also helped the people understand the natural environment and coping with everyday life. Usually, actually, the UNESCO or the Declaration on Science and Use of Scientific Knowledge recognize indigenous science as historical and valuable contribution to science and technology. That's why I'm saying a while ago that in the science basis, we cannot create experimentation if there's no historical background. Indigenous science or IKS system or indigenous knowledge system is our historical background. Without that kind of field of that kind of science, we cannot explain what is literally been arising or what is literally a science is or what is or how can we define the science. We can go back or we will go back to the history itself. So indigenous science is very important to know for us to know how does the our ancestor survive in a certain era. They uses indigenous science. And when we literally said indigenous science, it is a traditional way on culturing the field of science. Okay? So I think that's the end of our discussion. So your task for this afternoon. So your task for this afternoon is there are two. We have 8 questions that you should unlock. So I will be giving it on our GC. So this will be your task. Then you will be giving it next week, face to face. Write it in a yellow paper. Okay. So only 2. This think about this question and also this question. That's it. So that is the end of our lesson 4, which is the indigenous science and technology in the Philippines. So next week we will be going to explore the science, technology, and society and the human condition, and that is started with what human flourishing that given by our great philosopher, and that is Aristotle. So please study in advance so that in my oral recitation you can answer my question. If you have questions and clarifications regardless to our topic, indigenous science in the field of or in the Philippines, you can literally ask me through GC, or you can contact me, or you can chat me through PM in my Facebook account. Okay? So happy holidays everyone. Thank you so much. Bye.